Beneath the surface in the cool, clear waters of Mercury Passage on the east coast of Tasmania, they're growing a crop billed as a revolutionary solution to the red meat industry's methane problem. The National Science Agency, CSIRO, discovered that bioactive compounds or chemicals in the native red seaweed Asparagopsis can reduce emissions in ruminant livestock by up to 90%.
We're growing the seaweed out in the ocean. It's submerged within the water column, so it's not being grown on the bottom or on the surface. We have to do environmental monitoring as part of our permits with our lease. So we monitor about 47 sites around our farm to ensure that we're not having a detrimental impact on the natural biodiversity. We haven't seen anything to date that would suggest we are.
How's it looking, Woodsy? How much you got to go?
Sam Elsom is a former fashion designer and brand developer turned seaweed farmer. His startup, Sea Forest, is now growing its crop on 300,000 metres of line in an aquaculture system developed from scratch.
Everything from the way we deploy the seaweed to our methods for harvesting, have been a process of many iterations and modifications to machinery to get it to a point where now it's more or less an automated process.
Sea Forest has raised $58 million to develop systems to farm and process Asparagopsis. It wants to be a global player in reducing livestock methane, which accounts for 15% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Rocky Denies is the company's chief scientist.
They're the start of selecting the best strain that we can use to grow at scale.
As a professor of aquaculture at James Cook University, he worked with the CSIRO on its discovery of the methane-busting potential of Asparagopsis.
Really, the challenges are scale. The science challenges are the finer details around closing life cycles and selecting for growth and selecting for bioactives. But I think the biggest challenge is making something big.
Working with universities, government agencies and its own 10-strong team of scientists, Sea Forest has been able to increase the active compounds in Asparagopsis by 600%. The company is now scaling up for commercialisation. It's developed Sea Feed, a formula using canola oil that easily fits into feeding systems in feedlots and dairies. The company says it already has capacity to produce enough Asparagopsis to mitigate methane in 2 million head of cattle.
Where we're up to now, I think, is that we've got a process that we're pretty comfortable with. We've got assets that we know how to farm on a consistent basis, but what we need to do is further work to optimise the cost of production and also to help to work with farmers to get more livestock on the supplement.
I think patience is the key to all of these novel technologies. We've still got a ways to go. We've got a lot of efforts that are being applied to it, and I think we will see the result in time, but I think patience is the key.
Alex Baker is the Chief Executive Officer of Future Feed, which holds the intellectual property for the CSIRO's Asparagopsis discovery. It's issued licences to 8 companies in Australia and overseas, including Sea Forest. Mr Baker says trials are ongoing to ensure the feed additives developed are safe, effective and commercially viable.
I think we're still talking years. I think the next 18 months will be quite pivotal in terms of where supply technology and scale gets to, and then the distribution of those products.
At Ranges Valley Feedlot near Glen Innes in the northern tablelands of New South Wales, they feed 40,000 head of Angus and Wagyu cattle for between 270 and 500 days. Their long-fed beef supplies branded products in about 50 markets around the world. They've been trialling the sea feed extract since last September. The initial research centred on animal health and food safety.
Before we put any feed additive into our program, there's a level of due diligence that we need to do. We can say that there's no negative impact as a result of feeding Asparagopsis. .
The oil-based supplement is costing about $1 a day per animal. The research is now looking at its effectiveness when used for the last 100 days of an Angus feeding program. It's not just about saving money. Any small change to the carefully formulated rations could impact meat quality.
Consistency is king. There's a lot of stuff we can't control. We can control our consistency in our ration, our makeup, our accuracy of feeding, our timeliness as well. So yeah, very important to our business.
The beef produced in the trial will be subject to taste and tenderness testing by the University of New England.
We want to understand, has there been any differences in flavour profile or meat tenderness? It's absolutely critical to measure those cattle that have been fed Asparagopsis against our control group to see if there's any differences at all within the result of the feeding out of Asparagopsis.
The algal biofuels journey is very similar to what's happening now, in my view. It's technically correct in a lab, but when you place it into the context of the real-world solution of flying planes and cars and everything on algal biofuel, it's not a reality.
Pia Winberg is a marine ecologist and the founder of Australia's first commercial seaweed farm. She fears that just like the failed algal biofuels industry, investors will be caught up in the hype of an Asparagopsis industry which may never be fully realised. She's in the process of scaling up tenfold her New South Wales South Coast operation, which produces a native green seaweed for food, cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. She reckons the red meat industry should instead be using food-grade seaweed to improve livestock health and feed conversion. This would reduce emissions by cutting the use of fertilisers and fossil fuels used to grow grain.
We should be growing more efficient crops like seaweed, and if we added 10% of seaweed into cattle feed, it would be a bit like the E10 fuel. It's the E10 beef. You would actually eliminate fossil inputs into the beef industry.
P is someone who, certainly inspired me before we started Sea Forest, and continues to do great work in this space. So she's someone whose opinion I respect, but in this instance, when it comes to Asparagopsis cultivation and her criticisms, I don't agree.
Pia Winberg says the green seaweed processed at her factory has been rigorously assessed by the National Food Standards Authority. But Asparagopsis has not had the same scrutiny. She's worried about the active compounds in Asparagopsis called bromoforms. They're highly volatile and can be toxic.
It can affect the staff members that are handling it. It can even affect the food chain that we're putting it into. So if you just take a small piece of Asparagopsis, it's not like a toxin in it that's going to poison you from that minor exposure. But once you start concentrating this volatile, means it shoots up in the air really easily. Once you start concentrating masses of this volatile compound, yes, it can knock people out in a lab. And it's like chloroform, and people don't use that except under fume hoods.
Bromoforms are chemical compounds closely related to chloroform, which was widely used as a general anaesthetic in the first half of the 20th century. Its use was discontinued because of its harmful effects on human health.
It is toxic in large amounts. We use it in a chemistry lab. We can use it as a solvent or as a synthetic reagent.
Professor Mary Fletcher heads the Natural Toxin Group at the University of Queensland's Centre for Animal Science. She reckons it's too early to be talking about commercialising Asparagopsis.
There's no denying that Asparagopsis does reduce methane. The data strongly supports that it's very good at reducing methane. Whether or not it's safe as a long-term product, there's still data to be gained, and the industry is still gathering that sort of data.
Low levels of bromoforms are commonly found in drinking water as a byproduct of disinfectants. But at high levels, the United States Environmental Protection Agency says they could cause cancer in humans. Sea Forest Rocky Denies says it's all about the dosage. The cancer claims are based on a study of toxicity in rodents, where acute doses of bromoform were administered.
The dose that an animal is given to mitigate methane is 200 to 500 times lower than the dose that affects toxicity. And if you think about that in the context of a person, it's 1 Panadol against 500 Panadols.
The Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, the APVMA, is the independent statutory authority responsible for assessing and regulating agricultural and veterinary chemicals in Australia. But it's not regulating Asparagopsis, or for that matter, any other anti-methogenic product, because it says they're not strictly defined as veterinary medicines. If, however, they show some sort of productivity gain or claim to do so, they will require registration. In your opinion, is there a need for some sort of oversight?
I was surprised that the APVMA chose not to regulate. I believe there should be. I work in a field of natural toxins, so plant toxins that poison livestock, where sometimes it's an acute toxin where an animal dies straight away. But in other cases, it's a chronic toxin where the animal's exposed to a plant in a pasture for long periods of time, and you only see toxicity 2 years down the track.
In the Tasmanian Midlands, Asparagopsis has been part of the daily feed ration at Annandale Farm since the end of 2020.
How are you getting on this morning, Jatinder? All good? Yep, all good, yeah.
Richard Gardner conducted the first carbon audit of his farm in 2003 and is an industry leader in the quest for a more sustainable, carbon-neutral dairy industry.
The dairy alone emits 6,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year, and 4,000 tonnes of that is the methane, the enteric fermentation. I just think that we've got a moral obligation to do something about climate change, and this is our opportunity for the livestock industries to do that.
The safety and effectiveness research is being conducted by Fonterra, the world's largest dairy manufacturer. Tests on individual cows and their milk, as well as herd samples, have failed to reveal any adverse impacts or residues.
This year we will move into product samples to make sure that there's nothing that shifts in terms of, as we translate the milk and produce products like cheese and butter, that there's nothing untoward. That is our expertise, and it's something that's fundamental to our promise to our consumers.
More dairies will be added to the research this year, but Fonterra can't say when it will recommend Asparagopsis to its 650 Australian suppliers.
I think we've still got to just make sure we're being methodical through the steps, and I don't want to be categorical about the time, and that's because we start to set deadlines around timelines rather than focus on making sure we're super clear around the safety and efficacy of the product, and then the timeline will take care of itself.
But we're talking years.
We are still talking years, that's right, to make sure we're really comfortable around that.
So this here is the asexual life phase of the seaweed, called the tetrasporophyte. So we can grow this on land.
Sam Elsom says his company is poised to expand production significantly by growing it on land as well as at sea.
I am frustrated. I mean, all of us that work within sea forest and within this space have been working hard to try and accelerate adoption and to create the climate impact that we know is possible. And you know, we respect that in some cases things like food safety, animal welfare, product testing are all really important steps on that journey. We do feel that having participated in over 8 academic trials using our product, that we're building in confidence around those aspects.
He says land-based production will bring down costs, but what would really boost uptake is a market mechanism to incentivise farmers reducing methane.
So a carbon credit is an obvious one because we are talking about methane emissions avoided, and they have a carbon equivalence of about 28 times that of carbon dioxide. So there is an obvious pathway there.
Future Feed says a carbon credit will accelerate the take-up of Asparagopsis.
Methodology is in work at the moment, and that framework, once that starts to become locked down, then we actually have a mechanism to actually put the whole value stack together. And so somewhere in between, I think the current, low-price chemical products that don't have the same efficacy and the high-priced seaweed product, I think, will hit an equilibrium.
Carbon credits may still be a way off, but the market is already moving. This is called a game changer, and it's made with Asparagopsis-fed beef. It's being marketed as the world's first methane-reducing burger. The grilled burger chain is not the only market mover.
So Sean, here we've got the very first Asparagopsis-fed garment, and keen for you to try it on. This is a prototype. It's basically like the first IBM computer. We're looking forward to scaling up production. First year was 100 kilos, and then we've moved to a tonne of wool now.
Menswear chain MJ Bale has already spent $350,000 to audit and decarbonise its chain of 80 retail outlets. It wants to be a market leader in an industry that produces 5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions.
As a first step in the process of carbon neutral wool, we're well underway.
For its Asparagopsis-fed wool, it partnered with the University of Tasmania and the Apple Isles Kingston Farm, which already provides fine wool for garments that the company markets for their traceability and sustainability.
It's early days, it's expensive at the moment, and I think that's what we're working with Sea Forest and other partners to try and bring that cost of production down, because right now it's uneconomic, but who knows what the future holds.
There'll be some people who'll look at what you're doing and they'll say it's just greenwashing.
Yeah, look, I don't believe what we are doing is greenwashing. I mean, we're putting our money where our mouth is. We write a cheque for hundreds of thousands of dollars to offset our emissions entirely, and we're going carbon positive in the next few years as well as part of that. We think it's really important to reinvest into community, into the planet, and back into our product and for the well-being of everybody. It's an all-inclusive thing, this is not, we don't think it's an optional thing to do. We think it's a mandatory thing to do.
There's still some caution at industry level. Fonterra is studying cows at Annandale Farm across their entire lifetime.
That consistency of readout is really important, Sean, to make sure we've got herds through multiple lactations all the way through to cull cows and at the end of their life cycle. So it's really important to have that year in, year out to build a body of evidence around how the trials worked.
And Matt Watt says on the question of any production improvement in the animals fed Asparagopsis, the jury is still out. The Ranges Valley trial has also failed to show any improvement in feed conversion and growth.
So from a commercial aspect within that feeding operations on these preliminary cattle that we've killed, we can't quantify any efficiency or productivity gain as a result.
If the APVMA does regulate Asparagopsis, its focus will be on animal health. Exposure to bromoforms in the supply chain is another matter. Safe Work Australia has set maximum exposure levels for bromoforms, but it says implementing, regulating and enforcing these is up to the Commonwealth, states and territories. WorkSafe Tasmania says it's had no cause to inspect the operations of Sea Forest. But there were clear guidelines for all companies to follow to ensure their workers are safe. At Sea Forest, harvested seaweed is kept alive to reduce emissions and kept covered until processing. The company says its oil-based medium traps the bromoforms in the product, making it more potent as well as much safer.
So we found a stable delivery medium, and we've also established a production process flow that ensures that all of our workers are safe.
The company says it has measured bromoform levels in its factory and they were within the recommended safe levels. It says it will continue to monitor bromoform exposure. Meat and Livestock Australia says Asparagopsis is good to go, but it's just one tool in the nation's emissions reduction toolbox. It has spent more than $140 million on research since it set its goal 6 years ago for the red meat industry to be carbon neutral by 2030. The grower levy funded research has supported dozens of projects, including the world's first on grass-fed animals.
we're measuring methane out in the field. To do that, we use what's called a green feed system. So the animals have their automated RFID tags in the ear. When they come inside, that registers and it drops a set amount of pellets to those animals. As the animal eats those pellets, we then measure the methane in the breath as they're breathing while eating. So I just grabbed some pellets to show you.
Sarah Meal runs the University of Queensland project, which is testing a synthetic chemical additive developed in Europe, trade-named Bovair. It's looking at its effectiveness in backgrounding operations, where cattle are transitioning from pastures to feedlots.
So far, we've seen some really promising results in terms of both methane reduction and productivity. So we've seen around a 10 to 12% reduction in methane with our Bovair and a little bit of an increase in weight as well.
Meat and Livestock Australia says it's on track to achieve a carbon neutral industry by 2030.
So we've reduced our emissions by almost 65% since that baseline year.
Is part of that, though, because the national herd is smaller?
Yes, that's definitely part of it, but it's also a lot to do with vegetation in the landscape. So ultimately there's been more trees growing in the landscape and less clearing of vegetation as well.
Margaret Jewell is managing MLA's carbon neutral program. She says methane abatement offers the most potential for achieving the 2030 target.
At the end of the day, the more that we can reduce those methane emissions down, the less that we have to rely on being able to offset that methane with carbon stored in the landscape.
There may still be more future-proofing needed for Asparagopsis, but sea forest is already expanding. The company recently bought this former abalone farm at Swansea on the Tasmanian mid-east coast and is currently modifying its 660 ponds to expand on-land production. The company wants to develop a land-based system that it can export to the world.
It's a way for us to create a proof of concept or a demonstration of what can be replicated in other parts of the world.
The whole spend so far is $58 million. Are your investors starting to get a bit nervous about a return?
I think we're fortunate to have very much climate-focused and impact-focused investors, mainly from high net worth and family offices. And so I think we're all very much aligned with the mission and the potential that we can achieve. Obviously, all of us would like it to be happening a lot faster, but we're all on the journey and I think everyone's proud of the progress that we've made.